Hello and welcome to another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. As the world of Malifaux changes, alliances are shifting and some loyal guild servants are showing their true colours. As today's story shows, the rot of the Resurrectionists goes much deeper than anyone thought. I hope you enjoy the first installment of Nemesis Part 2.
Nemesis Part 2 by Mason Crawford. Mortimer took another bite of his egg salad sandwich, causing a generous amount of its contents to fall out the back and splatter onto his shirt. He barely even noticed as he strolled back to his employer.
"Nothing of note in the second room,"
he reported through a mouthful of food. The sounds of his chewing were almost as loud as his voice.
"Got the rotters, the old rotters, that is, ones we showed up with, standing watch in case we missed someone. But I doubt it."
"I take it one of the warehouse workers was in the middle of eating his lunch when you ambushed him." Nicodem's tone was decidedly disapproving. His assistant shoved the last parts of the sandwich into his mouth and sucked each of his fingers clean, one at a time. He garbled a response, but his words were buried beneath too much bread and egg salad to make any sort of sense. With a sigh, Nicodem turned his attention back to the warehouse's employees. He had swarmed into the building with over a dozen of his strongest zombies, expecting a battle with the Ten Thunders agent who had ruined his plans of toppling the guild from power, but the workers had barely put up a fight. As he walked from one reanimated worker to the next, he took stock of their vacant and glassy-eyed features. Only one of them was Asian, and he was dressed in pants that were 2 sizes too large and a shirt that had been inexpertly mended multiple times.
"This the one, then?"
Mortimer strolled up to the zombie, squinted his eyes, and leaned forward to examine the dead man in greater detail.
"Doesn't look like much of a thinker, does he?"
"No, he doesn't." Nicodem turned away from the zombies and allowed his gaze to wander back over the warehouse. The building was split into 2 rooms, both of which were stacked with wooden crates and smaller corrugated cardboard boxes.
"What's in these boxes?"
Mortimer bent down, picked up one of the cardboard boxes, and heaved it up onto the top of a nearby wooden crate. After fumbling for a moment with the string that held the package shut, he finally bested the knot, pulled back the string, and opened the box to peek inside.
"Well,"
he said after a moment, his face screwing up in confusion.
"At a bit of a loss on this one, boss."
Nicodem moved closer, his lips pulling back into a tight frown. The interior of the box was packed with a 6 glass jars, the lids of which had been punctured with small holes. As he watched, Mortimer wrapped his meaty fingers around one of the jars and pulled it upwards to view the contents. A fat, furry white moth sat lazily atop a pile of half-eaten leaves.
"Looks like someone decided to bottle up some bugs for some reason."
Mortimer shook the glass jar, sending the moth toppling from its leafy throne, and grinned in sadistic satisfaction.
"It's a silk moth."
Nicodem took the jar from Mortimer, who was inspecting the rest of the jars in search of a scorpion or another more interesting insect. Each new jar, however, either contained a new moth, a fat grub-like caterpillar, or a rounded ball of silk.
"Some businessman is likely importing them from Earth in the hopes of creating a silk market." "Yeah?"
Mortimer lifted one of the jars up to his eyes to stare at a particularly fat caterpillar.
"These buggers are worth a pretty penny, then."
Nicodem didn't bother to respond. Instead, he set the moth jar back in the box and returned to the zombies of the warehouse workers, which were still standing obediently in line. Jackie had lied to him about the presence of the Ten Thunders agent who had betrayed him. That much was certain. But he had yet to work out the purpose of her lie. If it was merely a ploy to draw him away from somewhere more important, it succeeded, though he couldn't begin to imagine what the benefit might have been to the girl or the Ten Thunders. If it was a trap, and that was feeling more and more likely to Nicodem, Then it had failed to spring. Or had it? He paused, his hands folding together over the skull-shaped head of his cane. Just because the trap hadn't yet sprung didn't mean that the noose wasn't slowly tightening around his neck. His mind went back to their arrival at the warehouse. The entrance faced the waterfront, which had allowed his crudely disguised zombies to approach the building without too much harassment. The few dock workers that spotted the horde had their lives quickly and unceremoniously snuffed out by his magic, though he had chosen not to raise them from the dead at the time. In his experience, it was often wise to leave a few corpses hidden away, in case he needed to make a quick escape. Had he noticed a glint on the other side of the river? It seemed unlikely, but in his mind, the possibility slowly began to blossom into a paranoid certainty that someone, possibly a group of people, had watched him and his undead horde enter the warehouse. It might have been a spyglass or binoculars, or the scope of a sniper's rifle. "I am an idiot," he murmured. "What's that, boss?" Mortimer gave the glass jar he was holding another shake as he looked up at the other necromancer. He had found a cockroach hiding between two crates and dropped it into the moth's jar, and now he was trying to make the two creatures fight by shaking the jar to rile them up. "Something wrong?" He glanced back towards the other room. "Want me to get the other rotters?" Nicodem walked to the warehouse door and tapped the head of his cane against its surface. "The 10 Thunders have set up snipers across the river. They never intended to give us a traitor. This entire meeting was a setup, intended to draw us out into the open so they could deal with us at a distance." Mortimer tucked the jar under his arm and rubbed the back of his neck with the other hand. You sure about that? Seems like they could have just popped our noggins on the way in if they were snipers. Maybe saved the lives of this sorry lot before the old murdered and turned into a rotter thing happened, you know? Quiet. Nicodem closed his eyes and stretched his senses out towards the river. He could feel a few corpses at the bottom of the river, anchored down by cement shoes or heavy weights. But he paid them no mind. Instead of animating the dead, he reached into his pocket, clasped his hand around a soulstone, and drew upon its power as he spread out his mind across the river itself. Almost immediately, a thick, dreary fog began to rise up out of the river and spill out across the riverfront slums. Nicodem waited a moment, then stepped back and motioned to Mortimer. "We're leaving now. The fog should conceal our escape from the snipers across the river." As one, the newly created warehouse zombies and the zombies in the second room all lurched into motion and started shuffling towards the door. "Mortimer, open the door." Mortimer cast a leery glance towards the warehouse's entrance. "You sure about that? Not that I'm doubting you or anything, but what if one of them supposed snipers has some sort of fancy rifle that can see through the fog? Or enchanted goggles like that mercenary bloke we worked with down in Edge Point?" The faintest ghost of a smile haunted Nicodem's face. "Try not to get hit in the head. It makes the reanimation process much more troublesome." His companion's eyes narrowed as he pulled out a cigar and shoved it into his mouth. He glared daggers at Nicodem, lit the end of his cigar with a match, and tossed the burning match to the ground at Nicodem's feet. The zombies stopped just short of the door and stood in front of it like an expectant crowd, all of them staring down at the door handle. "Fine," Mortimer grumbled under his breath as he shoved his way to the front of the crowd. The glass jar still tucked under his arm. "Years of service, carrying your corpses this way and that, and this is the thanks I get. Bullet sponge to the great and powerful Nicodem. You're just lucky I'm such a dependable soul, hard-working and all that. Good luck finding someone else to put up with your stuffy ass once I'm gone, you pompous, self-centered son of a—" Mortimer's stream of half-muttered complaints continued as he threw open the door. A bank of sickly grey fog, heavy with the scent of water and rotting fish, billowed into the room, engulfing Mortimer all the way up to his bowler hat. There was a swirl of movement as he grabbed the closest zombie and shoved it out the door in front of him, pushing it forward as if it were a hostage. When no rifle shots rang out to cut his assistant down, Nicodem motioned to the rest of the zombies, sending them staggering out into the street in a shuffling horde. He was right behind them, his pneumatic leg clomping loudly on the cobblestone street as he followed his minions into the cold fog. Lady Justice was slumped over her desk, her head resting on her folded arms. The wounds she suffered from the resurrectionist assault on the Guild Enclave had been healed with soulstones, but her sword arm still ached from where McMorning had severed the muscle. McMorning. The very memory of the Guild's former coroner caused her cheeks to burn in shame. That her former colleague had been a resurrectionist was all but obvious in hindsight. The incomplete paperwork, the missing corpses. Hell, the missing corpses alone should have tipped her off. Should have tipped someone off. Cutting through her ruminations, the faint sound of footsteps turned toward her office. They were unusually soft, like those of a cat. The sound combined with the faintest scent of familiar cologne, almost strong enough to mask an underlying, more unpleasant odour. Justice sat up, ran a hand through her short red hair, and turned her head toward the door. "I'm not in the mood for gloating, Lucius." Lucius Matheson paused in the doorway, his hand raised as if to knock on the open door. His expression was inscrutable behind his mask. Without any sense of awkwardness, he lowered his hand and settled it atop the head of his cane. "Nor am I. May I?" With a sigh, she motioned to the seat opposite her. Lucius glided into the room, shut the door behind him, and sank into the offered chair in a single smooth motion. Once seated, he leaned back, crossed his legs, and rested his cane atop his knee, perfectly balancing it there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Minutes passed in silence. Just as Lady Justice opened her mouth and drew in a breath to ask Lucius what he wanted, he spoke. "Word is spreading through the Enclave about the dressing down you received from Marlowe. After allowing our Spanish friends to be butchered by a resurrectionist that was technically part of your division, no less, and allowing their priceless artifact to be destroyed. It's no wonder he's upset. I dare say that they could hear the shouting all the way in the guard barracks." Justice's body tensed against her will. "So this is gloating, then?" "On the contrary." The amused tone in Lucius's voice disappeared so quickly that she doubted whether it had ever been there at all. "You and I are in a similar position, Miss Justice." "Are we?" Her expression was cold, and annoyance dripped from her every word. "Forgive me if I'm not seeing the comparison." Lucius held up his hand and inclined his head, an expression that, for anyone else, might have come across as begging for patience. From Lucius, it was just condescending. "You and I have both been marginalized by Marlowe. Where once we were allowed to do whatever we wished, now we have endless channels of approval to go through. Paperwork that must be filled out before every operation. That infernal punch card machine that Hoffman created." He released a carefully timed sigh of frustration. "Personally, I am surprised that you were even allowed to keep your job. I would have thought that this latest failure would have been the final nail in your coffin, so to speak." As much as she wanted to nurse her annoyance, to tell Lucius just where he could shove his clever little opinions as she threw him out of her office, his words found a weak link in her mental armor and deflated her anger. Justice leaned forward, rested her elbows on the table, and buried her head in her hands. "Marlowe still thinks he's on Earth. He doesn't understand that the resurrectionists aren't some organized group that can just be taken out with a few properly timed raids. Even if we caught Seamus and Squidpidge, and Ankoku, and the rest, we still have an entire quarantine zone filled with horrors, not to mention the sewers. And von Stuck." She fell back into her chair and pressed the palms of her hands against her blindfolded eyes. "The man broadcasts lessons on creating mechanized zombies to anyone with an ethervox.
How are we supposed to stop that? Outlaw ethervoxes?
Lucius endured the rant with quiet patience. When it seemed that Lady Justice had reached the end, he spoke up. It does seem as if you need a notable victory to prove the worth of your department. I would hate to see the death marshals turned into... What was it that Marlowe wanted to do with you? Make you a pretty face on a recruitment poster. He made a disapproving tusk-tusk sound. Lady Justice exhaled an unsteady breath and lowered her hands. Of all the people to whom she could have vented her frustrations, it had been to Lucius. She knew that she was never going to hear the end of it.
Over my dead body. I'll toss my badge in his face and walk off into the quarantine zone alone if I have to.
With most of your death marshals right behind you, Lucius mused. He placed a gloved finger on the end of his cane and pressed downward, tipping it slightly to one side. Marlowe would no doubt shift the responsibility of dealing with the resurrectionists to the Guild Guard, and within a few weeks that group of idiots would all be dead and marching against us as a horde of particularly dim-witted zombies. Her eyebrows raised beneath her blindfold in surprise. Careful, Lucius. That almost sounded like praise for my division. It was. He inclined his head in respect. There is a reason that I rarely bother to interfere in your work, Ms. Justice. The undead and those who create them are a blight upon this land. And with recent shifts in power elsewhere, I do not wish to see that battle abandoned for the sake of petty politics. Upon seeing the suspicious look on Justice's face, he withdrew a manila folder from his jacket, placed it upon her desk, and tapped it with two of his gloved fingers. This should help. Justice didn't reach for the folder.
You're not one to offer help freely. What sort of strings are attached to this?
None at all. Lucius snatched up his cane and stood in a single graceful movement. As I said, you and I are both outsiders now. If Marlowe does not wish to help you seek your revenge upon the resurrectionists, and I am able to do so in my own small way. Justice was silent for a moment. Then she reached forward and took the folder. The files inside were written in Braille, and her fingers glided over the raised bumps with practiced ease. A third of the way through the report, her hand froze in place.
This is the monitoring report for the undertaker's warehouse.
Lucius twirled the cane in his hand. Not entirely. The warehouse is owned by a shipping company with ties back to the Katanaka Trading Company. That seems strange, doesn't it? He stopped twirling his cane and pointed it at the folder. Still, my agents did catch sight of a man matching your suspect's description leaving the premises. They trailed him all the way back to a mansion in the southern slums. The address is on the last page there. The pages of the folder flipped back in rapid succession as Justice ran her fingers across each one, her excitement rising. When she finished the last page, she opened her mouth to say something, but the door to her office was already closing behind Lucius. Despite his assurances to the contrary, Justice knew that she owed Lucius for the report, and that he would not hesitate to call in the favour when it most inconvenienced her. At the moment, however, she didn't care. She was back on the hunt.
I'm telling you, Nicky, you should embrace the moment.
Seamus was strewn across an upholstered sofa, looking up at the decaying woman who was slowly and methodically feeding him a cluster of grapes. He swallowed the latest offering as it was dropped in his mouth, and turned his head to look at his fellow necromancer.
The Guild finally knows who you are. Let's get that ugly mug of yours plastered across the city. Maybe a few double homicides to get you into the swing of things. And then who knows?
He winced as the undead woman dropped a grape into his ear, causing it to bounce off his head and go rolling across the floor.
Hey! He shouted up at her. Not while I'm talking, love.
On the other side of the room, Nicodem suppressed yet another sigh. He was bent over his work table, carefully stitching up the Y incision on his latest cadaver. He had already sewn together a dozen corpses since his failed ambush at the warehouse the day before. He intended to push his undead forces well into the high double digits before he made his move against the 10 Thunders. The small voice in the back of his mind kept urging him to hurry, telling him that he was running out of time. Seamus's unexpected appearance certainly wasn't helping. Nicodem sped a glance back at the lounging serial killer, the light from the suspended lantern turning his glasses into circles of white. "If you insist on bothering me, could you at least do so more quietly?" "You're just sour grapes, 'cause you haven't seen guardsmen go pale when they hear your name." He motioned to the undead woman, and another grape disappeared into his mouth. "Trust me, this is going to do you a world of good. I've got a list of new brothels that I was thinking about hitting up. Morty's already on board, though I suppose I didn't mention the whole murdering part to him." Nicodem's nose scrunched up in disgust as he turned back to his work. "I do not have time to waste on such trivial matters. The 10 Thunders may have missed their opportunity to spring their trap, but they will not sit idle for very long." Seamus rolled his eyes. Yeah, some secret crime syndicate wants you dead because you couldn't single-handedly wipe out the guild." With a heave, Seamus lifted himself to his feet and stretched his arms out above his head. "Well, as much fun as this is, I'm going to go check in on Dougie. Now that he's unemployed, he should have plenty of time to go spend with his old pal Seamus." Behind him, the undead woman carefully dropped a fresh grape onto the empty couch. "You know the way out." Nicodem pulled the last stitch tight, just as something crashed through the window. He had barely even registered the sound before the flaming bottle struck the hardwood floor and shattered, spraying oil and glass everywhere. The oil ignited with an audible whoosh, turning the couch that Seamus had been sitting on a moment earlier into a bonfire. Seamus yelped in surprise and twisted around so quickly that he stumbled and fell over onto his bottom. His undead grape servant, who had been splattered with some of the flaming oil and was now in the process of becoming a bonfire herself, reached down toward him, her flame-licked and rapidly blackening arms outstretched in desperation. "Already!" Nicodem pushed himself to his feet and snapped his fingers. The cadaver he had been sewing together instantly sat up, its mouth hanging open to reveal yellow, rotted teeth. It swung its feet to the side as it climbed down from the work table, only to fall into step behind its master, who was already retreating down a side hallway. "Seamus, take care of your—" A deafening gunshot roared out as Seamus put a bullet in the flaming zombie's head, bursting it like one of the blackening grapes she still held in her fingers. She managed to make one final step before collapsing to the ground in a heap. "Thank you," Nicodem murmured. He followed the hallway all the way to the main foyer as more windows shattered in the guest rooms to his left. Black smoke was already billowing out from their doorways, and a few were already engulfed in flames. He pulled what undead he could from the rooms that had yet to be consumed, and left the others to their fiery fate. In his mind, he had already lost the mansion, but that was an acceptable sacrifice. It was only a temporary residence. His true home, in Nicodem's mind, at least, had always been the Governor-General's mansion. Seamus pushed his way past the growing horde of zombies, battering them aside with the butt of his pistol and cursing at each one. "Nicky, hold up! The whole place is going up in flames!" "Death waits for no man," Nicodem intoned. As he reached the foyer, he pressed his hands against the double doors and swung them open. His zombies surged past the two of them into the foyer just as a powerfully built death marshal in a long duster kicked in the front door and sent it skidding across the floor. The horde of zombies cascaded down the stairway as he fired up at them, each bullet finding its way into a zombie's head and dropping it to the ground. On the 7th shot, however, his pistol clicked on an empty chamber, and then zombies were upon him, dragging him down and tearing him to pieces. Next to Nicodem, Seamus grinned as he reloaded his flintlock pistol and watched the chaos unfolding below. "You know,
If you had told me that you were planning a party, I would have brought more of my girls. They have us surrounded and my home is burning down around us.
Nicodem cast an annoyed glance at his fellow necromancer.
I would hardly consider this to be a moment of excitement.
Seamus laughed and winked.
That's why you don't have any
His words were drowned out by a rapid succession of gunfire, so close together that each gunshot blended into the next like rain falling upon a tin roof. Bullets sliced into the room below, through the open doorway at first, and then through the walls, jerking the feeding zombies back and forth uncontrollably as their decaying flesh was ripped apart. Even the more durable zombies, the ones that Nicodem had specifically reinforced to endure gunfire, were cut in half by the unrelenting hail of death. When the gunfire finally wound down into a low mechanical whine, Nicodem's face had turned white.
It would appear as if the guild has decided to employ a Gatling gun. Can you...
He glanced to where Seamus had been standing, but there was no sign of his fellow resurrectionist. Seamus had disappeared, and left him to deal with the guild on his own.
Nicodem couldn't even convince himself that he was surprised.
Very well. He turned and marched back down the hallway into the clouds of black smoke and the orange glow of spreading flames.
I'll do it myself.
That's it for another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Join us next time for the continuation of Nemesis Part 2.